Hello, everyone. And I know it's been a while, but we are now back with some more Django. So, in this case, this is now going to be a start of a new series where we're going to be tackling something that is kind of a subset of Django. It's something that we call the Django REST Framework. So, the Django REST Framework is a module that we could add into our Django applications that will let us put in some REST functionality. So one may ask, what does REST actually mean? And what could it actually do? So later on, we're going to be discussing what these kinds of requests will entail. So before we start, let's have a bit of a presentation. All right, so let's start off with Django REST Framework. So to begin, we first need to get these prerequisites out of the way. So when we're going to be creating a project in Django, of course, we need to have a desktop or a laptop to fully utilize our coding capacity. Of course, coding on a phone will be pretty difficult, so much rather type it out on a keyboard, at least for most people. So I'd recommend doing this tutorial using a desktop or a laptop. The next thing to have is the Python fundamentals. So this would basically get you up to speed with how to use Django, and this is pretty much prerequisite of how we learn Django in the first place. So learning all about Python is essential when we're going to be using a Python framework. With that being said, we also need to discuss some of the Django fundamentals as well. So for learning about the Django fundamentals, we actually have my previous series available here in our channel. So you can feel free to check that out if you're curious about what the Django fundamentals are, because these are needed to fully understand our discussions in the Django REST framework. And lastly, of course, we need to have the motivation to learn, as this is going to be an extensive series that's going to be talking about how we're going to apply Django REST Framework in our own applications. So now with the prerequisites done, hopefully you could come back to this video if you don't have one of these pat down and ready to go. But once you're here, hopefully you have all of these available and you're ready to learn. All right, so let's move on to the next slide, which we are going to be discussing. So now we're going to discuss what actually is an API. So for discussing what an API is, we are going to use this image as sort of a model or sort of a example on what the API actually does. Right here, you can see on the page that we start off on the very left with a bunch of end users. Here, I think I could turn on the pen. There you go. That looks very good. So you can see in here, end users are at the very left side of the screen, meaning they are going to be the clients or the people who are going to be receiving or requesting for data. All right. So what we're going to do next is, after the end users make a certain request on their, let's say, their browser or their mobile device, what we're going to do is we're going to send a request from them all the way through to an API using probably a Wi-Fi network or a certain connection. So this will end up going to our web server, and it will process this request and see if it is a valid request. And if it is, it will interact with the database and see what it will do. So that also goes in turn with the reverse manner. So if it was able to process the request, or if it was not able to process a request, the web server needs to return a certain response or a certain callback as to what happened with the user's request. So from the API, it will then link back a certain response to the user to let them know if it was successful or if there was an error that was encountered along the way. So that's pretty much an API. So what we could surmise, or what we could conclude from this kind of analogy, is that an API is like a messenger between software programs. They essentially allow programs to talk to each other. They're like, one would say, walkie-talkies, or like communicators for the user and the web server. So there are instructions or API specifications that define how this communication will work. So in most cases, APIs are going to be links between certain programs. Like, let's say your website will create a request to a web server that contains your database. So an API is responsible for giving you data, even updating it or deleting data. An API can pretty much do it all. So unlike a user interface designed for people, APIs are for programmers to build applications that use the features of other programs. So what we're basically saying here is this API will allow us to use certain codes or certain programs that are created by other programmers. Essentially, we're utilizing integration of other people's work or other people's code in our own website in a more transformative manner. So we're essentially kind of remixing or using their code or improving upon their code. All right. So API, in short, is a messenger between software programs. All right. So next is we have some API request methods to discuss. So for API request methods, we have things like the get, the post, the put, the patch, and the delete. So let's try and discuss each of these one by one. So there are definitely a bunch more methods that may be available, but for these are the most common requests that we see in APIs. So firstly, we have get. So for get, it retrieves data from a server, meaning, for example, if we are going to access a website, we are getting its certain page contents. We are getting data from the server to display on our page. So that is a pretty simple example of what get is. It pretty much retrieves data from a server. Next, we have post. So for posting, it is for creating certain resources on the server. For example, we want to add in a new index or a new kind of cell to a table. Then that's what we call posting to a certain database. We are saying a post to create a new resource inside the database through our API. We also have put and patch. So these two are pretty similar because they work in almost the same way. They just go about what they're doing in a bit of a different manner. So for put will replace an existing resource on the server with an entirely new version. So what it will do is essentially, it is going to get a certain resource. For example, let's have the pen right here. It'll get a certain resource, and it will pretty much overwrite the old resource. So what we're saying is you could remove the old one and bring in the new. So that's what putting is essentially overwriting the old version of a certain file. All right. So next up, let's erase these. We also have patch. So what patch does is a bit less of a replacement and more of just an updating of an existing resource on the server. For example, we have a certain document like this, and this document will contain certain fields. So what patch will do is it will either replace certain fields in our API, or it will put in a new field, or remove certain fields. So pretty much just updates the contents of an existing resource or existing document or row in our database. All right. So next up, we also have our delete. And this is pretty self-explanatory. It allows us to remove a resource from the server. So that is pretty much the basic request methods. Of course, we use all of these to create the simple CRUD methods. So if you're very familiar with programming, you may be familiar with what CRUD is. And yes, to describe what this is, you could say CRUD, like so. It will stand for create, apologies for my writing. We could say create, read, update, and delete. So you could see how all of these methods are propagated using these request methods. Very useful and allow us to do some simple database management through an API. So these kinds of requests are done over a server. So they're not done directly on the database, which makes them very useful. All right, so let me turn off my pen here and let's go to the next slide. So now we are going to discuss what REST API is. So REST API is pretty much using the contents or the rules of an API, except what it does is it's going to send out a JSON or an XML from that API. For example, we say the client here will create a request, say a request. And what this will do is it will send over to the REST API to do a certain kind of request to the database. It's kind of like our middleman between the database and our client. Essentially, this is going to translate it. Let's say it turns it into ones and zeros to give a certain request to our database. And what the database will do is it will return a certain response to the REST API, and it will translate it to our client. And what is the most distinguishable part of a REST API is it normally works with JSONs or XMLs. So in our case, what we're going to use is JSON since it's very similar to Python dictionaries. And if you're not sure what that is yet, I highly suggest to check out the Python fundamentals before we start this course. All right, so now we have that out of the way, let's give a bit more formal definition as to what REST API is. Well, at least in this case, how REST API is going to be used inside of Django. So here, Django will make use of the Django REST Framework. It's kind of like how Django is its own framework, except now there's a framework and a framework where we're able to utilize REST or REST API using our Django project. So what we're going to do here is start from the top. Here we could see Django REST Framework is often abbreviated as DRF, is a toolkit that simplifies building web APIs in Django, a popular Python web framework. So what do we see Python or Django normally as? We normally see it as a web page created. So normally we see it as like creating web pages for us. It's going to be kind of a render. It will even take in user inputs. But in the case of making it an API, we are not sure about how that works yet. But since we have Django REST Framework, it allows us to use it in the context of a REST API. So let's say right here, here's what DRF will offer. So normally, when we are going to be programming in Django, normally in Django, we do things like views or certain kinds of models, forms, and URLs that will lead to certain resources on our page. In this case, what DRF will do is it will still use the models, but in this case, it's going to use things like serializers, where it will use Django REST Framework's built-in views to be able to handle our requests. So we're going to see how that looks like later on, because right now we're still in the theoretical stage. We're discussing what all of these can do and what all of these could pretty much build up to. Okay, so here we see easier API development. It will offer tasks like data formatting or serialization. We'll see how that looks like later on. Authentication, meaning if we need a certain permission or a certain authorization before we handle certain requests. And of course, it will also handle requests like a REST API should. Here it also offers the RESTful approach, which is what we were talking about a while ago, where we are going to use certain HTTP requests to create a well-structured API. So here's where we bring in the get, the post, put, patch, and delete. And lastly, if you're very familiar with Django, this is going to be a cake or a piece of cake. Yeah, this is going to be a piece of cake to learn or start off with, as this is definitely built by Django developers for Django developers to use. So it will utilize Django concepts like class-based views, forms, and more, making it easy to learn for those already familiar with Django. So it's going to use what we already know, except in this context, we are going to be utilizing all of these views to create an API instead of a normal web page. All right, so we have a lot of drawings in here, so let's just try and delete all those. Okay, and I'll also turn off my pen. There you go. All right, so now that we're done with the theory, let's move on to our coding. So I'm going to put in my Visual Studio Code in here. So right here is where we're going to be starting our Django tutorials. What I'm using right here is Visual Studio Code. If you don't have this downloaded yet, feel free to download it from the official website, or you could follow along in your own code editor if that is your choice. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to set up the Django project, and for now we'll leave it at that, and in the next video we'll start off with some coding. Alright, so in here, what we're going to do is open up our terminal. So what I did was use the Ctrl-J shortcut to open up this view, and we should see that I'm currently in my desktop in the Django DRF tutorial folder. So there you go, that is pretty much the correct folder to be in. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is, so I need to firstly create a virtual environment. So you may ask, why do we need a virtual environment for this Django tutorial? So the reason for that is because a virtual environment will pretty much make an isolated folder or isolated instance of Python for this folder only. So it's kind of like how Git is for specific folders. In this case, a virtual environment will be a Python only for this specific folder. It's pretty much only in the scope of this folder we are in. So let's say I'm going to say py-m venv and venv. So what I did here was I'm using the py, which is a Python shortcut. So we say Python if you want to be full, but we'll say py to make it a lot shorter. And we're going to say -m, meaning we're going to be running a certain module of Python. And then we're going to use the venv, which is short for the virtual environment module. And what we're going to call our virtual environment is going to be venv. So this is the name of our venv folder. So later on, we're going to see some activation scripts that will let us run an isolated instance of Python in this folder. So let's try and hit on enter right now. And let's wait for it to do its thing. So right now it's loading some modules to create our virtual environment. And as you can see in our folder, we could see our venv, and it also has a bunch of files inside of this as well, letting us create our own instance of Python in this folder. All right, so next thing to do in here is activate this virtual environment. So we'll say venv/scripts/activate, and this will let us run a certain script right here. We'll go to venv, go to scripts, and run a certain activate that is corresponding to our system. In this case, we are going to be running a batch command since I am on a Windows system. So I'll hit on enter, and you could see that at least in PowerShell, it will show that we are currently in a virtual environment. So that is going to be for running a virtual environment. All right, so now that we have that ready to go, we could now install Django. So right here, I actually have a shortcut to install using pip. So we'll say pip install Django like so, and it will pretty much run a certain installer that will put the modules for Django inside of our folder. So right here, we could see that Django, ASCII-ref, SQL parse, and TZ data are going to be installed, and these are just prerequisites to install Django as well. Django uses these modules. All right, so now that we have all of those available, we also need to install pip install Django REST Framework, because that's also a separate module that we need to include in our Django project. All right, so now that both of these are available and completely installed, the last step for this video is going to be starting our project. So what we're going to say in here is Django-admin start project, and we'll name this project tutorial, and I'll put it in the same folder by putting a dot at the very end. All right, so we're saying in here, we're going to start a Django project in this folder, and we'll name it tutorial, and we'll install the Django project in this same folder. Let's hit on enter, and we could see that our Django has been successfully created. So we could see our project is now ready to be started. So in the next video, we're going to set up Django REST Framework along with starting our very first view in DRF. So hopefully we are going to stick around for the next video, and we will see you in the next one. Thank you very much for watching One Code Camp.